Well, welcome down here to Rothes House. Here we are in the heart of Speyside. We're sitting in the manse, one of the old manse, which is the old minister's house, belonging to the Church of Scotland. And up until about, it was built in 1840, and up until about 1975, this was owned by the church. And the minister, traditionally in Scottish villages, certainly from the 18th century onwards, used to have a house that was above everybody else. His flock was always beneath him. The second most important house in the village was always the bank manager. But the bank manager was considerably lower down in terms of height to of course, the priest, or the minister. Anyway, we purchased the house and we did it up because when I used to come here as a kid, my grandparents lived very close by. It actually had water coming down the inside of the walls rather than the outside. Anyway, Berry Brothers and Ryan purchased it, and we put it back to its former glory, really. So that's where we are now. The house was built in about 1840, and around that time there was a terrible problem within the church where it split three ways. The Church of Scotland, which is a Calvinist society, originally from Switzerland and drifted up through Europe and into Scotland, but it meant that nobody worked on Sundays. And up until sort of the 1970s, I suppose, even on the west coast of Scotland, which was quite Calvinist as well, you couldn't get a boat, for instance, to the islands on the Sunday, on the Sabbath. You never did anything on the Sabbath except go to church. And it was thanks to the church that we still have a distillery, actually, because in 1878 there was a banking crisis in exactly the same way as there was one in 2008. And at that time the distillery was midway through its construction, thanks to a loan from a bank called the Caledonian Bank, which was a subsidiary of the City of Glasgow Bank, which went under. Unlike modern banks, this was an unlimited bank, which meant that any shareholder obviously had to pay whatever the debts were, and out of the original 1,300 shareholders, 300 remained. But where did we find the money to finish the distillery? Well, it came from the only place that there was cash. And that was the United Presbyterian Church of Scotland, from Nakando, the neighbouring parish to Rothes. They had cash of £600, and in spite of the fact that whisky was always known as the devil's brew, they loaned us £600 to complete the distillery. And it's thanks to them that we're here today. But it's quite interesting that the church for many years thought that whisky was the devil's brew, or at least told people that it was the devil's brew, because of, I suppose, the social side of whisky drinking, or excess whisky drinking. And this time, 18 months ago, I had the Pope of the Church of Scotland, he's called the moderator, to lunch here in this very room. And I offered him a glass of whisky after the second course. He said, "Why were you so reluctant to offer me a whisky before?" And I said, "Well, it's just that for several centuries, moderator, you have always called whisky, your church has always called whisky, the devil's brew." And he said, "Oh, hypocrites as we were in those days." He said, take a dram. And I offered him a couple of bottles to take home with him to Edinburgh, which he gladly accepted. And I think we've sort of got the half blessing, therefore, of the Pope of the Church of Scotland, the moderator of the Church of Scotland. That was last year, and we also had, interestingly, a rabbi from the London Beth Din come up to see the Edrington plant in Glasgow, where we are bottling Glenrothes, and one expression in particular called the Alba Reserve. And the rabbi came up to inspect the building and the process to make sure that no wine was in close proximity or indeed touching or had been seasoning the casks which we use for making Alba, because that wouldn't be then considered kosher. And so, having done the inspection, he gave his blessing as well, and we now have the Alba Reserve, which is a kosher expression. It's got the London Beth Din K, which is obviously kosher, on the back of the bottle.